I'm Adam Riley. Tonight on Greater Boston, President Joe Biden has begun stopping some weapon shipments to Israel as he publicly pushes back against Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's war plans. Did student activists behind the past few weeks of campus protests help convince Biden to change his stance? Plus, Massachusetts is suing Uber and Lyft to classify rideshare drivers as employees. GBH News State House reporter Katie Lannon joins me to break down the case. The Biden administration is making perhaps its staunchest condemnation yet of Israel's attacks on civilians in Gaza as Israeli forces mount attacks on the city of Rafah, where more than 1 million Palestinians have been seeking refuge.
Going into to Rafah, even to deal with these remaining battalions, especially in the absence of a plan for civilians, risks doing terrible harm to civilians and not solving the problem, a problem that both of us want to solve, which is making sure Hamas cannot again govern Gaza.
President Biden also recently decided to pause a shipment of bombs headed for Israel, all of which has come amid weeks of pro-Palestine protests on dozens of college campuses. So what is behind the administration's shift and what might it mean moving forward? I'm joined by Gregory Aftandilian, adjunct professor at the Pardee School at Boston University, a professor at American University in Washington, D.C., and a former State Department Middle East analyst. Thomas Whalen, a Boston University professor with focuses on modern foreign policy and American politics, and Michael Astrew, former associate counsel to George H.W. Bush and Ronald Reagan, among other things. Thank you all for being here. Tom, am I right to take what the Biden administration has said in recent days in tandem with this report that came from the State Department, which found that it is reasonable to suggest that Israel might have been inconsistent with international humanitarian law when it comes to its deployment of weapons. Is it fair to take all of this collectively as the biggest shift in tone from the U.S. since this conflict began?
I think that's fair, though not surprising, because, President Biden is losing a good part of his political base here among young voters. And he's trying to thread the needle here politically, but I don't think he's succeeding at all.
You see it as driven by political considerations, the shift in tone?
I think so. It's hard to look at it otherwise. He does not want to criticize Israel before a general election in November, but that's the position he forced himself in, given his comments and given the domestic situation right now.
Gregory Aftandilian, let me ask you the same thing. Is this the biggest shift in tone we've seen? And if so, what do you attribute it to?
Well, it is probably the biggest shift in tone vis-a-vis the Israel-Hamas war. But also, Biden has had a very difficult relationship with Netanyahu over many, many years. And many of you will recall that the judicial overhaul plan that Netanyahu's government wanted elicited Biden's criticism. And that was on an Israeli domestic issue. Mm-hmm. Now, the war, when the Hamas attacks occurred, Biden, of course, went to Israel, embraced Netanyahu, met with the families, met with the war cabinet. So there was a very tight embrace. But over the past several months, Biden has become increasingly frustrated that so many Palestinian civilians have been killed, and the Israeli government is not doing enough to protect those civilians.
Mike Astrew, do you think that the protests that we've seen on a number of college campuses, including several here in the Boston area, have played a role in pushing the Biden administration to this point?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and I think it's fraught with danger for the president because, on the one hand, he has people from the left getting behind the more extreme elements in his party. But on the other hand, he's got a lot of independents, some Democrats, looking at the way the Ivy League has been handling the protests, tying it together with other resentments against woke culture. And I think there's a real reaction in the other direction as well. So there's no easy way out for him. I'm not sure that this is going to be a net political win for him at all.
Gregory, let me go back to you for a moment. You wrote a piece recently in which you talked, among other things, you talked about the potential domestic consequences of the war for President Biden and former President Trump. But you made the point in that piece that there's really been a sea change among Democrats generationally when it comes to views on Israel and Palestine. Can you just briefly synopsize what that sea change has been?
Well, older Democrats are still very much in support of Israel, but younger Democrats there's been a big shift. There was a Quinnipiac poll of late 2023, which I have the statistic here. It says 69% of Democrats and Democratic-leaning voters under the age of 30 disapprove of Biden's handling of the war, the Israel-Hamas war.
It's a big number.
We see a big generational shift within the Democratic Party. And Biden, of course, this is an election year, and he's very concerned that he's going to lose that younger vote.
Tom Whalen, I want to get your take on the possible domestic fallout from this, how this could play out. Before you weigh in and offer any sort of prognostication or analysis, let's take a look at how former President Trump is framing recent developments in the Biden administration on the campaign trail.
This week he announced that he will withhold shipping weapons to Israel as they fight to eradicate Hamas terrorists in Gaza. No, it was shocking to hear it. Even while there are still American hostages being held by Hamas, Crooked Joe's action is one of the worst betrayals of an American ally in the history of our country.
So with that as a prelude, what do you see happening as the Biden administration stakes out the rhetorical territory that it is staking out right now? How do you see it affecting domestic politics moving forward, from the campaign to actions that might be taken by Congress involving foreign aid to Israel and to other places? What do you think is going to happen?
Well, I think from henceforward, particularly foreign and military aid to Israel is going to be a highly debated issue in Congress among Republicans and Democrats. And this is kind of a new thing, you know. Israel, or aid to Israel, has always been a bipartisan move in both parties. Now it's going to be a major issue. At the same time, you hear it from people like Lindsey Graham in the Republican Party, and even Speaker of the House, you know, Mike Johnson has hinted of it, that, you know, this is a betrayal of Israel, and that in a way Biden has betrayed the Republicans, the deal they cut on aid to Ukraine and Israel, and also to Taiwan. And who knows, given the rancorous partisan atmosphere, many Republicans I can see who are on the extreme right might be calling for Joe Biden's impeachment before the election.
Specifically over this.
Over this issue, saying that, you know, he is defying the will of Congress. This is a high crime and misdemeanor in their minds, and they want to punish him for it. And if they do or not, it's still, Biden is in a tough spot politically.
Mike Astro, could you see that? Oh, yeah, by all means. Go ahead, Gregory.
Yeah, the atmospherics, of course, are lending itself to Republican criticism. But we have to also remember that Congress passed this huge supplemental aid package, which Biden completely supported, which was something like $14 billion in additional military aid to Israel. So it's not like Biden is abandoning Israel. It's just that he set markers saying that if you do go into Rafah in a major way, we're going to hold up offensive military weapons.
Mm-hmm. And just to be clear, can you tell people a little more about the weapons that he is saying he's going to hold back?
Well, he said he's going to hold back bombs. And he even said, you know, in December of last year that Israel has engaged in indiscriminate bombing. And he's also said he's going to hold back artillery shells. This is what he said to CNN just last week.
Mm-hmm. Mike Astro, what do you think about the impeachment scenario that Tom floated a moment ago? Do you think that is realistic?
I mean, to be honest, Republicans have been calling for impeachment about many things. Right. And I don't think it matters very much, but I would disagree a little bit. Because I think the real threat here is not from the Republicans, it's within the Democratic Party itself. And historically, your other two guests would be right about the likely reaction. But we've slipped into a nutsy area in politics. And what I think the big risk for Biden is the convention coming up. Because you're going to have, you know, 10,000 unsupervised Democrats in one place with nothing productive for them to actually do.
Right.
And I think the likelihood that becomes a flashpoint for frustration for Democrats that support Israel, Democrats that support Hamas, and Democrats just looking for trouble. I think it's likely to be a zoo, and I think I think unless they're very, very careful, that could be the beginning of the end for President Biden. So I think it's going to play out more within the Democratic Party, and I think it's going to be unexpected and not something that we've seen before.
Mike, shades of 1968, you're saying?
A little bit like 68, but I think it's going to be more out of control. In 68, you still had party bosses that could control delegations and that kind of thing. I don't think in either party you have that kind of political control over your people anymore. And people get elected and picked by people other than the old party bosses. And so if the head of the delegation says, look, cut that out, they're not going to stop. And so I think that's the big risk in the short term. So we'll know, within a couple months.
Yeah, we'll know very soon. Gregory F. Tendillian.
If I add something here.
Yeah, by all means.
It's not that there are Democrats supporting Hamas. There are Democrats supporting the lessening of civilian casualties. I mean, it's 35,000 Palestinians have died, and 2/3 of which are women and children. I mean, at a certain point, one has to have empathy for the number of Palestinian civilians who are really in dire situation. So you do have a split within the party. I agree. You have some stalwarts who are going to say, we'll have to support Israel no matter what. But then you have other factions will say, we still support Israel, but we just don't want them to engage in more civilian deaths.
So clearly there are Democrats of that profile, but it is, in my opinion, it's just simply not true to say that there aren't Democrats out there really supporting Hamas. And if you look at the college campuses, that's clearly true. You look at the flag, they're flying the Hamas flags. They're parroting the rhetoric of Hamas. I don't think there's any doubt about that. And you've got an element in Congress and the quote-unquote squad, including one of our local members of Congress, who are, in my opinion, right out there, with the wrong side.
Based on statements that I've seen from Congresswoman Presley, I think if she were here, she would push back. I think she would say she's not a Hamas supporter and that she's denounced the October 7th attack.
But certainly President Trump is going to frame it in that way.
He will frame it in that way, absolutely. Well, we've only got about 2 minutes left, but I'm interested in hearing, we've talked about potential domestic consequences. Gregory, do you expect this shift or sharpening on the part of the Biden administration to have any effect on what Israel and Prime Minister Netanyahu choose to do in the coming weeks?
I actually don't, because Netanyahu has actually even said publicly, we can do things on our own. And they probably do have enough weapons already in their stock to go into Rafah. And I think Netanyahu has a domestic political consideration, because he believes that if he doesn't finish the job, quote unquote, in Rafah, his whole political legitimacy is at stake. Mm-hmm. So I think he's going to defy Biden, and he knows that Republicans in Congress will support him. So that's the calculation I think he's made already.
I'd love to have the two of you weigh in, and you'll end up getting the last word, Mike, just because you're further to my left than Tom is. So, Tom, how do you think this might affect the Israeli government's prosecution of the war?
Well, I think they're in it for a long time. It's not in the political interest of Netanyahu to wrap this up quickly. He would lose support, of the right wing of his coalition, and they would abandon him like a drop of a hat.
His government could collapse.
Right, exactly. And Hamas is not going to retreat either. So it's in neither of the main antagonist political interest, and that's the true tragedy here.
All right, Mike.
I agree with that. I mean, he is not going to stop until he gets the hostages, and whether he gets them through a negotiated deal, which would be difficult and take a long time, or he gets them through military force, which is going to be difficult and take a long time. I think that he and a substantial number of people in Israel feel that's the only way they can go.
Okay, Michael Astor, Tom Whalen, and Gregory F. Tendillian, thank you all for being here to talk this through.
Thank you.
Next up, how should rideshare drivers be classified? That is the question at the heart of Massachusetts' lawsuit against Uber and Lyft, which kicked off in court today. Attorney General Andrea Campbell argues that companies misclassify their drivers as independent contractors rather than employees who are entitled to many more benefits, including minimum wage, overtime, and sick pay. Lawyers for Uber and Lyft argue that their drivers don't fit into a traditional employee role. They're also behind a state ballot question that would establish a law declaring their drivers independent contractors. GBH News State House reporter Katie Lannon was watching the proceedings in court today. She joins me now to help break all of this down. Hello, Katie. Good to see you as always. So this case was filed way back in 2020 when the Attorney General was now Governor Maura Healey. Finally coming to trial now. What did the respective sides have to say in their opening arguments?
So these are not new arguments at this point, and they're ones that we've heard play out in the State House and in campaign commercials even at this point, that what Uber and Lyft are saying is that they operate, rather than a transportation company, they're not a taxi company. They say they operate more like Airbnb or Etsy.
Decentralized clearinghouse for individuals who want to do things?
To connect, they describe their drivers as entrepreneurs who want to be able to set their own schedules, who might have other jobs or family obligations or personal interests and schedules to work around. And they say that flexibility is what draws people to this job, and it's a key component of the contractor model. Now, what we're hearing from the state, from the Attorney General's office, is that Uber and Lyft have a level of control over each ride. They have a level of data and a level of involvement that doesn't square with the contractor model. That the ride is the product that they're making their money off of, and that they have loyalty programs, financial incentives, and other ways to kind of shape drivers' behaviors, schedules.
So very hands-on as opposed to laissez-faire. That's the contention from the state.
Right.
By the way, the state's Fair Labor Division, this is in the Attorney General's office, this is just interesting for people to ponder. They say this is what it takes for workers to be treated as contractors. Work has to be done without the direction and control of the employer. Work has to be performed outside the usual course of the employer's business, and the work is done by someone who has their own independent business or trade doing that kind of work, which obviously ties into everything that you just mentioned. There is another ballot question. I mentioned the ballot question up top that is backed by the industry. There's another one that is opposed by the industry and is intimately connected to this lawsuit that we're talking about right here. What is that other ballot question?
Sure, and this is where it all gets to be a little bit of a tangle, right?
It's very messy, yeah.
But the ballot question you're referring to, which is backed by labor unions, who also oppose the other ballot question, but we'll talk about that later. And this ballot question would let Uber and Lyft drivers unionize under the state's collective bargaining laws. And one of the things that we've heard from in various discussions about this is that this ballot question, the unionization push, is designed to kind of stand either way, whether ultimately under state law drivers are contractors or employees, they'd still be granted this collective bargaining right if the voters sign off.
I see. So it was crafted with this court fight that we're talking about in mind, and so it could weather whatever the outcome is.
Yes, and since, this court fight has its roots way back 4 years ago, it's something that is really at the heart of all the discussions, and it's never too far from the front of anyone's mind.
There is a precedent for the rideshare companies, if things happen in a particular jurisdiction that they don't like, regulatory steps are taken, whatever they may be, of taking fairly drastic action. Can you just offer a super brief description of what's happened elsewhere in one or two cases?
Yeah, there was an instance a few years ago in Austin, Texas, where Uber and Lyft pulled out of that city for about a year over concerns with a fingerprinting requirement for drivers. And they ultimately only came back when state level legislation was passed to change that. They've also said that, we could see as soon as this summer, those two companies leave Minneapolis over a wage ordinance there. They're kind of waiting to see what happens, again, legislatively. And the possibility of Uber and Lyft pulling out of Massachusetts is something lawmakers have asked about when they had the company executives in to testify. They didn't get a clear answer in their questioning. So it does seem like that is something that's on the table, either as a reality or as a bargaining chip.
It just occurred to me, I am no attorney, as you know, but I wonder if Uber and Lyft's willingness to pull out of certain markets might be used by people who disagree with the rideshare companies on this question of whether their workers are employees or contractors. Because if the entire company can pull out, if it's not left up to individuals, again, thinking out loud here, but that's an argument that seems to potentially undercut the contractor claim that the rideshare companies make. Okay, just to make things even more confusing, there is that ballot question that's backed by the industry, and it would do what exactly?
So even the exactly part of that question is a little tricky to answer because
it's a terrible question too, because it kind of puts you on the spot.
So
what would that do?
The reason I can't give you an exact answer is because there are multiple versions in play. The question was knocked off the ballot. A similar question was knocked off the ballot in the previous cycle. It didn't meet the qualifications. So this time around, the Industrybacked group putting forward multiple versions of the question. I believe there are 5 in play, and they range from just defining the drivers as contractors to some alternative versions would grant them new benefits along with cementing that contractor status.
Okay. What happens if the judge in the case that just kicked off today, finally after 4 years, what happens if that judge says, yes, in fact, the drivers are employees? And what happens if then, later on this year, voters pass a ballot question saying, in fact, rideshare drivers are contractors? How would that conflict be resolved?
Well, I think we still continue to have trouble talking about what goes on in that situation, more confusion. But it is worth noting and being clear here that the ongoing trial is about current state law and what is required under current state law. The ballot question would create a new law. So that would be kind of forward-looking. The Attorney General's office has said that if that scenario plays out, if the lawsuit says they're employees and then voters decide they should be contractors, there'll still be a retroactive period of benefits that were due when the drivers
really interesting.
Were employees but classified as contractors, and they'd go after those benefits. They'd seek to have that paid.
I never would have thought of that as being a possible wrinkle. That's really interesting. Okay, both these questions, ballot questions that are headed in the general direction of voters later this fall, they're both being challenged at the Supreme Judicial Court. What is the grounds for the challenge that is being brought by people who don't like the anti-industry measure and who don't like the pro-industry measure?
This is the most common reason you see ballot questions challenged in court. The idea with the ballot question system is that what is presented to a voter when they're in the polling booth, it's something that should be one coherent policy, and your average person can look at it and say, I want that or I don't want that.
All this stuff fits together.
Right. The challenges for both ballot questions or both sets of ballot questions argues that they don't do that. They mix too many different parts, and it would be, a voter might want Section A but not want Section B and not be able to square those two ideas. So we'll hear from the court relatively soon, within, long before Election Day, whether those are eligible.
I know that there is another of the many ballot questions that have popped up in this cycle. There's another one that's being challenged at the SJC. What is it?
Yes, that one would phase out the lower sub-minimum wage for tipped workers and replace that with the state's full $15 minimum wage for people like waitstaff in restaurants. The argument that critics of that question have brought is that it also includes a section on tip pooling that would allow say, a restaurant owner to require that tips be shared between not only the wait staff, but also the dishwashers or the other folks in the back of the house.
And does that bring up the relatedness challenge again,
same
or
issue.
question?
We're not sure the court will go along with that. There were, in last week's arguments, there were a few instances where the justices seemed to say, yeah, this is all about the law on tips and how tipped workers are paid. So a voter could look at that as all one issue. So we'll see what the court decides there.
I always have a hard time when I'm watching those arguments at the SJC figuring out what the justices are thinking. Now, just to be clear about this minimum wage for tipped workers provision, which we may end up voting on this fall, it's worth mentioning to people that under current law, you're supposed to get paid at least the minimum wage if you're a waiter, right, or a bartender. If your tips don't bring you up to a minimum wage level of payment on an hourly basis, you're supposed to be compensated by your establishment, right?
That's right. It would fall to the employer to make up the difference. And the idea behind the ballot question is no matter what, you'd be making $15, and any tip you got...
Just as a baseline.
Yeah, any tip you got wouldn't bring you up to that baseline level. The tip would be on top as a true bonus. The supporters say that way it's the employers who are paying the cost of employing their workers. It's not on to the customer. And they also say that it's hard in the restaurant industry to know if you're being paid correctly under this model, and that leaving workers dependent on the customers for so much of their pay creates a system where they're vulnerable to bad behavior from guests. So, and then meanwhile...
You got to take abuse effectively.
Right, yes. And then you have others in the restaurant industry who like the way they're getting paid, who are, feel as though they're making good money with their tips as is, and are wary about the idea of tip pooling or just don't want to change from the current system.
I guess if you are a really, really terrific waiter, waitress, bartender, and the system's working for you, why bother to get rid of it, right?
Yeah, and it depends too on, probably the type of place where you work. The typical cost of a bill, of a meal out, varies dramatically. So I'm sure there's variations in what people receive on any given night.
Yeah, that makes sense. All right, Katie Lannon, thank you for helping me and hopefully some viewers to untangle this very, very complicated knot of stuff. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Adam.
And that is it for tonight, but we will be back tomorrow. I'm Adam Riley. Thanks for watching, and good night.